I bought 40 acres with a recorded hunting easement. The HOA president said she owned the view. She called my deer stand an eyesore. Then she called the county on me. Things got worse fast after that. Years later, I found her secret. What she'd been hiding would end her. My name is Jake Merritt, 36 years old, a diesel mechanic from outside Millbrook, Georgia. My father taught me to bow hunt on this exact ridge before he passed from cancer 3 years back. When the old Callahan tract went up for sale, I sold my truck and drained my savings to buy it, easement and all. I live alone in a single wide on the property while I build a real house. Slow and steady, weekend by weekend. My sister Renee checks on me most Sundays with her kids, and my dog Scout keeps me company the rest of the week. It's not much, but it's mine, and it's the closest I've felt to my dad since the funeral. The Callahan tract sat on the edge of Whispering Pines, a gated development of 40-odd houses built around a golf course nobody golfed on anymore. My land was outside the platted lots, grandfathered in with a deed that predated the HOA by 11 years. Hunting easement recorded in black and white at the county courthouse. My realtor warned me the HOA board could be particular about appearances, but she swore the covenants didn't apply to my parcel since it was never part of the original subdivision. I read the deed twice myself before closing, feeling like a man who'd finally done something smart with his life. Deborah Voss ran that HOA like a small kingdom. She'd been board president for 6 years, re-elected every time because nobody else wanted the headache of fighting her for the seat. People called her Debbie to her face and something else behind her back. I met her the second week I owned the place. She pulled up in a white Lexus, hopped out in workout clothes that had never seen a workout, and introduced herself as though I should already know the name. "I keep this neighborhood beautiful," she said, looking past me at my trailer like it offended her personally. I told her my land wasn't part of the HOA. She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're wrong. "We'll see about that," she said, and got back in her car without another word. I should have taken it more seriously than I did. Word around town was Debbie's ex-husband died in a hunting accident 9 years back. A stray shot from a careless out-of-state hunter on public land 2 counties over. Nobody talked about it directly, but everyone seemed to know. The way small towns know everything eventually.
I felt for her.
Genuinely. Losing someone that way leaves a scar that doesn't close clean. But grief doesn't give a person the right to decide what happens on land they don't own. And I figured once she understood my hunting was on my own property, she'd let it go. My neighbor Pete, who'd lived beside Whispering Pines for 20 years, laughed when I told him that. "Debbie doesn't let go of anything," he said. She once made a family repaint their mailbox 3 times because the blue was a half shade off the approved swatch. Pete told me about the Ramirez family, run out after 2 years over a garden shed the HOA claimed violated setback rules, even though the shed sat on land outside the association's boundary. Same as mine. They sold at a loss just to escape the fines and the whispering campaign that followed them to the grocery store. I didn't want trouble. In a tree stand, coffee steaming in the cold, the woods waking up around me the way they had every autumn since I was 9 years old, sitting on my dad's lap in a stand just like the one I was building now. I built my first stand that September, 16 feet up an old oak overlooking a natural funnel where deer moved between a creek bottom and a stand of white oaks. It wasn't fancy, pressure-treated lumber and a ladder I'd welded myself, but it was solid, and it was legal. I registered the stand with the state, kept my hunting license current, followed every regulation on the books. I wasn't some outlaw poacher. I was a landowner exercising a documented right on land I'd paid for in full, and I had the paperwork to prove every bit of it. Debbie's kingdom bordered my property on two sides. Her own backyard, in fact, backed up almost to my tree line, close enough that from her upstairs window she could see the top of my stand poking above the canopy like a splinter in her perfect view. I didn't think much of that at first. A tree stand isn't loud, isn't ugly if you're not looking for a reason to hate it, and I was 50 yards inside my own boundary line. But Debbie Voss had a way of turning 50 yards into a personal insult. The first letter arrived in October. HOA letterhead. Official seal stamped at the top like it meant something on my property. Unapproved structure visible from common areas. It read, citing a covenant section number. I laughed out loud reading it alone in my kitchen, then got angry when I realized she was serious. I called the number on the letter. Debbie answered herself, chipper as a game show host. Mister, I was hoping you'd reach out. I explained, calmly, that my property wasn't part of the HOA and never had been. The board disagrees, she said, like the board was some higher court. I drove to the courthouse that afternoon and pulled a certified copy of my deed and the plat map showing my parcel excluded from the Whispering Pines subdivision. I mailed her a copy with a polite note. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, doubling the alleged fine. Renee told me to just ignore it, that a fake fine from an HOA with no jurisdiction couldn't stick. She was probably right on paper. But paper doesn't stop a woman like Debbie Voss. And I was about to learn that the hard way, one small cruelty at a time. The first sign of real trouble came when my propane delivery truck got turned away at the Whispering Pines gate. The guard insisting my address wasn't on the approved vendor list, despite years of him driving that same route to homes outside the gate without issue. Then my mail started arriving late, sometimes with envelopes visibly opened and resealed. I couldn't prove Debbie was behind it. Not yet. But the timing lined up too neatly with every letter I'd sent her pointing out she had no authority over me whatsoever. At the next town hall meeting, held at the community center Whispering Pines residence used for association business, I showed up uninvited to speak my piece. Debbie stood at the podium in a blazer, gaveling the room to order like she presided over Congress instead of 40 houses and a dead golf course. When my turn came, I laid out the deed, the plat map, the county recorder's stamp. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Debbie just smiled and said the board would take it under advisement, a phrase I'd learned meant absolutely nothing to her. Afterward, an older woman named Carol pulled me aside in the parking lot. She does this, Carol whispered. Finds someone new every couple years. Wears them down till they either fold or move. I asked why nobody stopped her. Carol just shook her head and got in her car. I started keeping a folder. Every letter, every certified mail receipt, every email, time-stamped and organized the way my father taught me to keep engine maintenance logs. Because paperwork done right today saves you a world of hurt tomorrow. I had no idea yet how much I'd need it. Debbie escalated to fines posted directly to a resident portal. I wasn't even a member of. Numbers accumulating against an account that legally shouldn't have existed. $300 became $600 became $1,200. A number designed to scare a mechanic living paycheck to paycheck. I ignored the fines on principle, but the stress crept into places I didn't expect. I stopped sleeping right. Scout started barking at every car that slowed near the gate, and I found myself checking the tree line more than I checked the deer trails I was supposed to be watching. One Saturday, I found survey stakes driven into my land near the property line. Pink flags fluttering where no surveyor of mine had ever been. When I called the county surveyor's office, they had no record of any job requested for my parcel. Someone had planted them themselves. I pulled the stakes and photographed everything before I did, adding it to my folder. Pete came by that evening with 2 beers and a grim look. "She did the same thing to the Hendersons before they moved," he said. "Fake stakes. Fake violations. Wears you down till you quit fighting." I told Pete I wasn't going anywhere. He clinked his bottle against mine. "Good," he said. "Somebody's gotta be the one who doesn't fold." I didn't feel brave saying it back to him. Just tired and stubborn, which I was starting to think might be the same thing where Debbie was concerned. The following week, an animal control officer showed up at my gate on a complaint that I was illegally discharging firearms near residential structures. I hadn't fired a shot in weeks. The officer checked my license, my setback distance, found nothing wrong, and apologized on his way out. But the visit rattled me more than any letter had. Someone was watching closely enough to call in a fake report with just enough plausible detail to bring an officer to my door. I started to understand this wasn't going to stay a paperwork fight much longer. By November, Debbie had convinced 2 board members, a soft-spoken man named Gary and a newer resident named Ashley, that I was a safety liability the whole neighborhood needed protecting from. She started a group chat, invited half of Whispering Pines, and I wasn't in it, but Pete was, and he forwarded me screenshots. The messages painted me as reckless, dangerous, a stranger with guns lurking in the trees behind their children's swing sets. Never mind that my stand faced away from every house, that I hunted only at dawn and dusk during legal season, following every rule the state required of me. Someone in the chat suggested a petition to have the county force my hunting rights revoked. Debbie loved the idea, offered to draft it herself, offered to go door to door collecting signatures on a Saturday morning when she knew most working folks like me would be at our jobs. Carol texted me the draft petition, feeling guilty enough to break ranks. It called me a known threat to community safety and cited incidents that had simply never happened, dates I could account for with time cards from the shop where I'd been elbow deep in a transmission all day. I photographed the petition and added it to my folder, now 3 inches thick. My lawyer friend from high school, Danny, looked it over for free one evening and told me flat out, defamation, easy case, if I ever wanted to pursue it. I told him I just wanted to be left alone. Debbie's petition gathered 41 signatures, mostly from residents who'd never met me and trusted their board president's word over a stranger's silence. She presented it at the county zoning office, requesting an emergency review of my unregistered hunting operation, a phrase that made me sound like I ran a poaching ring. The zoning officer, a tired man named Mr. Okafor, called me in for a meeting and laid the petition on the desk between us. I laid my deed, my hunting license, my registered stand paperwork, and my easement documentation beside it. He read both sets in silence for a long 5 minutes. "This is all in order," he finally said, tapping my folder. "Your land isn't under their jurisdiction. I don't know what to tell you except that this happens more than you'd think. He filed my documents, closed the complaint, and told me to keep my folder close, because it wouldn't be the last time. I drove home relieved but shaken. Winning on paper felt hollow when I knew Debbie would simply try something else. Sure enough, within a week, a private security patrol, Whispering Pines contracted, began driving slow loops past my gate at odd hours, headlights sweeping my trailer at 2 in the morning. I complained to the security company directly. The dispatcher was apologetic, said they'd only been instructed to monitor a flagged perimeter address by the HOA president herself. No explanation given. No complaint filed against me by name. Just a flag on a map that happened to be my home. Renee started worrying out loud, asking if I'd consider selling and starting fresh somewhere without a Debbie Voss watching my every move. I told her no. And the kind he'd have loved, and I wasn't handing it to a woman who'd never fired a bow in her life. The holidays came and went with an uneasy quiet. Debbie apparently occupied with Christmas decorations and a neighborhood lighting contest she judged personally and, according to Carol, always awarded to herself under a technicality involving her own house being exempt from competition as host. In January, the harassment shifted tactics. A drone began appearing over my property most mornings, hovering near my tree stand, clearly filming. I couldn't prove whose it was, but Pete swore he'd seen Ashley's teenage son flying something similar from their backyard 2 lots over from Debbie's. I bought trail cameras of my own, partly for hunting, partly, I'll admit, to document whatever came onto my land uninvited. Within days, one camera caught a figure in a Whispering Pines golf cart pausing at my fence line, snapping photos on a phone before driving off. The footage was too far and too dark to identify a face for certain, but the golf cart bore a number I recognized from the HOA's own fleet, the ones residents could check out for neighborhood errands. I saved the clip, dated it, filed it in the folder that was becoming my second job. Debbie's next letter accused me of unauthorized surveillance of common property, for having trail cameras that occasionally, unavoidably, caught glimpses of the shared fence line between our parcels. The irony wasn't lost on me. A woman filming my land uninvited, complaining about a camera pointed at my own trees. I wrote back citing the same statute she'd tried to use against me, noting my cameras were entirely on my property and any incidental footage of hers was legally protected under the same logic she'd invoked. I never heard back on that particular letter, which felt like the closest thing to a win I'd had in months. But small wins didn't slow her down. In February, I found my gate padlock replaced with an unfamiliar one, a laminated notice zip-tied to the post declaring my access easement suspended pending board review of an easement that had never belonged to the HOA to suspend in the first place. I called a locksmith, cut the lock myself, and installed my own with a note of my own. This gate, this road, this land belongs to Jake Merritt. Deed recorded 2019. Book 447, page 12. Whispering Pines HOA has no jurisdiction here. I photographed it and mailed a copy to Debbie directly. That was the first time she called me herself instead of writing. Her voice was honey over steel. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, Jake. All you have to do is take that stand down and we can all move forward as neighbors. I hung up without answering. 2 nights later, Scout woke me barking at something near the tree line. I grabbed a flashlight and found fresh boot prints circling the base of my stand, and deep gouges in the latter rungs like someone had tried to pry them loose with a crowbar and given up halfway through. I reported it to the county sheriff's office as attempted vandalism and trespassing. A deputy came out, photographed the damage, took a report. But without a clear suspect, there was little more he could do than log it. Still, it went in my folder, page after page of a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Word had gotten around town by then, thanks to Pete and Carol and a few others tired of watching Debbie run people off. A local Facebook group for Millbrook started a thread about the Whispering Pines situation, and my name came up more than once. Some supportive, some skeptical, all of it new pressure I hadn't asked for. Debbie noticed the thread too. She posted a long comment defending herself, calling the accusations faceless rumors from a disgruntled newcomer who refuses to respect community standards. A line so polished it read like she'd used it before, on someone else, in some other fight I hadn't yet heard about. Curious, I started asking around about who'd lived at Whispering Pines longest. An older man at the hardware store, Mr. Ferris, told me about a family named the Okonkwo's, run off 6 years back over a flagpole that supposedly violated an obscure covenant clause Debbie herself had written into the bylaws 2 months prior. The pattern was becoming a shape I could name, find a target, invoke a technicality, escalate faster than anyone expects, wear them down with fines and rumors and small cruelties until they leave rather than fight. It had worked every time before. I intended to be the exception. In March, my homeowner's insurance company called with a strange question. Had I filed any liability claims related to hunting activity on my property? I hadn't. An anonymous tip to my insurer alleging unsafe conditions, prompting a review that could have raised my premiums or dropped my coverage entirely. I traced the tip's origin as far as the insurer's privacy policy allowed, which wasn't far, but the timing matched a week when Debbie had specifically emailed the board about exploring every available channel to get my stand removed. It wasn't proof. Wall of pattern. Danny, my lawyer friend, started taking the situation more seriously once I showed him the accumulating file. This isn't just an annoying neighbor anymore, he said. This is a sustained campaign. If you ever want to sue for harassment or defamation, you're building exactly the case you'd need. I told him I wasn't ready yet. Part of me still believed reason would win out, that showing up with the right documents to enough meetings would eventually embarrass Debbie into stopping. Pete told me that was the mistake everyone made with her. She doesn't feel embarrassment, he said. She feels thwarted. He was right. Debbie called an emergency board meeting specifically to discuss the ongoing safety concern at the Merritt property. Even though no new incident had occurred, no new complaint filed by anyone but her. I showed up again, folder in hand, ready to defend ground I shouldn't have needed to defend. This time she'd invited a county commissioner, a man named Reeves who owed his last campaign a favor or two to Whispering Pines donors. He listened politely to Debbie's presentation, full of doctored photos and exaggerated timelines, then turned to me and asked if I had anything to add. I handed him the folder. Map, easement, hunting license, zoning office resolution from January, sheriff's vandalism report, insurance tip timeline, screenshots of the group chat Pete had forwarded me. Reeves flipped through it in silence while Debbie's smile slowly lost its certainty for the first time I'd seen.
he said finally. It looks like the county already resolved this jurisdiction question months ago. I'm not sure why we're discussing it again. Debbie recovered fast, claiming new information had come to light, though she couldn't quite specify what that information actually was when pressed.
The meeting ended without resolution. Reeves promising to look into it further, which felt like another version of Debbie's own favorite non-answer. Take it under advisement. But something had shifted. A few board members who'd always deferred to her exchanged glances I hadn't seen before. Glances that looked almost like doubt. Gary, the quiet board member, caught me in the parking lot afterward. I've never actually seen the paperwork before tonight, he admitted, looking embarrassed. She always just told us it was handled. I asked him what he meant by handled. He shrugged and said he honestly didn't know, and that bothered him more than he expected. That single conversation planted something in me I hadn't felt in months. The idea that Debbie's control depended entirely on nobody looking too closely, that the board itself might not fully understand what she'd been doing in their name. I started wondering what else she might be hiding behind that polished smile. I mentioned this to Danny, who lit up at the idea. HOA presidents who operate that unilaterally usually cut corners somewhere else too, he said. Financial records, meeting minutes, election procedures. People that controlling rarely limit the control to just one thing. He offered to help me file a public records request for the HOA's documents. I said yes without much hesitation. If Debbie wanted a paperwork war, I'd finally learned to fight one on her own terms, methodically, patiently, building a case instead of just defending against her latest attack. For the first time since October, I felt less like prey and more like a man setting a trap. I didn't know yet how deep the trap would need to go, or what it would find when it closed. But that April evening, driving home past her darkened windows with my folder heavy on the passenger seat, I felt something close to hope for the first time in this whole exhausting fight. Strangely, May brought quiet. No letters, no fines, no golf carts idling at my fence line. I almost didn't trust it, checking my mailbox each day half expecting another laminated notice. But nothing came. Turkey season opened and closed without incident. My stand untouched. My mornings peaceful again for the first time in months. Danny filed the public records request through the county. Since Georgia HOAs registered as nonprofits had to disclose certain financial filings. It would take weeks to process. He warned. Maybe longer if Debbie's board dragged their feet, which given everything, seemed like a safe bet to make. I used the calm to finally pour the foundation for my real house. Work I'd put off through a winter of distraction and dread. Pete helped me on weekends, and for the first time since buying the land, it felt like the property I'd imagined instead of a battlefield I happened to live on. Renee brought her kids out for a weekend, and my niece Ellie sat with me in the stand at dusk, whispering questions about deer while we watched a doe and two fawns cross the funnel below us. I thought about my dad, about how this was exactly the kind of evening he'd have loved. Carol started stopping by occasionally, bringing banana bread and neighborhood gossip that had nothing to do with Debbie for once. She told me the lighting contest scandal had finally embarrassed a few residents enough to start quietly pushing for term limits on the board presidency. An idea that had never gained traction before. I let myself believe, briefly, that Debbie had simply moved on, found some other target, some other fight to occupy her need for control. Pete warned me not to get comfortable. She's not done, he said. She's just recalculating. Women like her don't quit. They regroup. I wanted to believe he was wrong. I wanted, badly, for this to just be over, for the fines to stop matching, for the folder to gather dust in a drawer instead of growing thicker by the week. For 6 quiet weeks. It almost felt like that wish had come true. In late May, Gary reached out to me directly, an unusual move given board etiquette. He wanted to meet privately, away from Whispering Pines, somewhere Debbie wouldn't hear about it secondhand. We agreed on a diner off the highway, the kind of place with vinyl booths and bottomless coffee. He looked nervous the whole time, glancing at the door more than once. I've been going through old board minutes, he said quietly. Some of the financial numbers don't add up the way they should. I don't want to say more until I'm sure, but I think you should know I'm looking. I didn't push him for details, sensing he needed to move at his own pace. But I told him about Danny's records request. And for the first time, Gary looked less like a man covering for his board president and more like someone quietly building the same case I was. The Public Records Office called Danny the first week of June with a partial release. Financial summaries missing several key attachments the HOA claimed were still being located. Danny found that suspicious on its face. Nonprofits that size rarely lost paperwork that specific unless someone didn't want it found. I spent an evening reading through what we did have. Columns of dues and expenses that mostly looked ordinary. Landscaping, insurance, the community center's utilities. Nothing dramatic on the surface. But a line item labeled Administrative Reserve appeared every quarter, growing steadily, with no explanation attached to what it actually funded. Danny flagged it immediately. That's either nothing, or that's everything, he said. Depends what's behind it. He requested a follow-up disclosure specifically for that account's transaction history. A request that would take Whispering Pines another month to even acknowledge receiving, let alone answer. I went back to my quiet mornings in the stand, trying not to let the waiting eat at me the way the harassment once had. But some instinct told me the calm was a held breath, not an ending, and that whatever came next would be bigger than anything Debbie had thrown at me so far. The held breath broke in mid-June. I came home from a double shift to find a demolition notice zip-tied to my stand ladder. County formatted, official looking, ordering removal of an illegal structure within 30 days or face contractor removal at owner's expense. A threat that made my stomach drop instantly. Something about the letterhead looked off, though. The font slightly wrong. The county seal slightly blurred like a bad scan. I called the county building department first thing the next morning. They had no record of issuing any such notice. No case file. No inspector assigned to my address at all. I photographed the fake notice and drove it straight to Mr. Okafor's office, comparing it against a genuine template on his monitor. "This is forged," he said flatly. "Someone printed a fake county notice and posted it on your property. That's a serious offense, not a prank." He offered to file a report with the sheriff's office himself, given the implications for county integrity. I agreed, though I already had a strong suspicion who'd done it, even without proof yet strong enough to name her out loud in an official complaint. The sheriff's investigator, a woman named Deputy Alvarez, took the forged notice seriously, dusted for prints, though a laminated flyer left outside for who knew how long wasn't likely to yield much. She asked pointed questions about anyone with motive, and I gave her Debbie's name without much hesitation this time. Alvarez couldn't act on suspicion alone, but she opened a file, cross-referenced my earlier vandalism report and the animal control complaint, and told me plainly that a pattern like this, escalating in both frequency and boldness, was exactly the kind of thing that eventually caught up with people. Debbie, meanwhile, kept up appearances at Whispering Pines like nothing had happened, hosting a summer barbecue with a bounce house and a taco truck, posting photos of herself smiling with children on her lap. The picture of wholesome community leadership for anyone who didn't know what I knew. Carol told me privately that Debbie had mentioned me at the barbecue, joking to a cluster of neighbors that my little hunting hobby wouldn't last much longer, that she had something in the works that would finally settle things once and for all. Nobody there thought to ask what that meant. A week later, my employer at the mechanic shop got an anonymous call claiming I'd been seen drinking on the job and questioning my fitness to work around heavy machinery. My boss, a straight shooter named Sal who'd known me for a decade, laughed it off and told me not to worry about it. But it worried me plenty. My property anymore. She was reaching into my livelihood, trying to destabilize the one part of my life that had nothing to do with Whispering Pines at all. I added the call to my folder, though Sal's dismissal made it hard to formally document. Danny said this shift mattered legally, that a pattern extending beyond property disputes into personal and professional sabotage strengthened any future harassment claim considerably. She's overreaching, he said. People like this always do eventually. It's usually what brings them down. I hoped he was right, because I was running out of patience. In July, the follow-up financial disclosure Danny requested finally arrived. Months later than legally required, with several transactions still redacted under a vague claim of personal privacy exemptions that Danny doubted actually applied to an HOA's administrative reserve account under Georgia nonprofit law. What wasn't redacted was troubling enough. Payments to a company called Voss Property Consulting, thousands of dollars over 3 years, for services described only as administrative support, a company that, when Danny searched state business registries, turned out to be registered to Debbie's own address. I stared at that discovery a long time. Debbie had apparently been paying herself, through a shell company bearing her own name, out of HOA dues collected from 40 families who trusted her to manage their money honestly. It wasn't proof of a crime yet, but it was proof of something deeply wrong. Danny explained that self-dealing like this, an HOA president funneling association funds to a personally owned entity without full board disclosure and resident approval, could constitute embezzlement or breach of fiduciary duty under state nonprofit law, serious enough to draw criminal charges if proven with intent. Gary, when I carefully brought it up at our next diner meeting, went pale reading the disclosure pages. I never approved any contract with a consulting company, he said. None of us did. Not that I remember. She just told us the reserve covered miscellaneous administrative costs. I never asked what that meant. Gary agreed to start quietly gathering old meeting minutes and board votes from his own files, comparing them against what Debbie had claimed was approved over the years. It was slow, careful work, the kind that couldn't be rushed without risking her noticing before we had enough to act. Meanwhile, the harassment at home didn't slow down. My propane deliveries kept getting flagged. My mail kept arriving tampered, and one morning I found the tires on my truck slashed. All for in my own driveway overnight. No camera catching a clear angle on whoever had done it. Deputy Alvarez came out again, added the tire slashing to my growing file, and told me candidly that the sheriff's office was building its own quiet case, though without a confession or clear physical evidence tying Debbie directly to any single incident. An arrest remained frustratingly out of reach for now. I started sleeping with a shotgun leaning by my bed. Not because I expected a confrontation, but because the constant low hum of being targeted had worn a groove of fear into me that logic alone couldn't smooth out. Scout slept lighter too, ears twitching at every sound the wind carried. Renee begged me again to consider selling, offering to help me look at land 2 counties over, somewhere quiet and anonymous. I told her I understood why she was asking, and I loved her for it, but leaving now would mean Debbie won, and too many families before me had already paid that price. In August, the county finally responded to the forged demolition notice investigation. Without a confession or clear forensic match, they couldn't charge anyone, but they issued a formal warning letter to Whispering Pines HOA as an entity, noting concerns about impersonation of county officials associated with the address. Debbie spun the warning at the next open board meeting as a clerical misunderstanding, blaming an unnamed former volunteer who'd supposedly overstepped their duties months ago and was no longer involved with the association. Several residents nodded along, satisfied, never questioning why a volunteer would forge a county seal on my behalf. I stood up anyway and asked directly, in front of the room, whether the board had approved any contracts with Voss Property Consulting. The silence that followed was long enough to feel physical. Debbie's smile flickered, just for a second, before she recovered and called the question out of order for tonight's agenda. Gary, sitting at the board table, didn't back her up this time. He stayed quiet, eyes down. But afterward he told me the question had visibly rattled 2 other board members who hadn't known about the consulting payments either. Cracks, small ones, were finally starting to show in Debbie's carefully managed kingdom. That same week, an anonymous message arrived in my inbox. No name attached, just a forwarded screenshot of a text conversation showing Debbie coordinating with the private security company to keep an eye on my property specifically, months before any formal complaint had ever been filed against me by anyone. I couldn't verify the sender, but the details matched too precisely to dismiss. Timestamps aligning with the exact week the late-night patrols began outside my gate. Someone inside Whispering Pines was starting to turn against her. Quietly, carefully, the way people do when fear finally loses to conscience. Danny added the screenshot to our file with appropriate caveats about its unverified origin, but noted that even circumstantial corroboration like this, multiplying across independent sources, built exactly the kind of preponderance of evidence needed for a civil harassment case, if not yet a criminal one. September brought bow season back around, and despite everything, I climbed into my stand at dawn on opening day with a lump in my throat, thinking about my dad, about how this land had become something more complicated than he ever imagined when he taught me to draw a bow at 9 years old. A doe stepped into the funnel just as the sun cleared the tree line, and for a few minutes, none of it mattered. Not Debbie, not the folder, not the fear that had colored so much of the past year. It was just me, the woods, and a quiet I'd almost forgotten I was fighting for. That peace didn't last past the drive home. A county code enforcement truck sat parked at my gate, an officer waiting with a clipboard, responding to a new complaint alleging unpermitted commercial hunting operations on my property. A claim as baseless as it was oddly specific in its wording. The officer, to his credit, seemed skeptical from the start, having pulled my file and seen the January resolution already on record. He asked a few routine questions, noted nothing amiss, and left without incident. But the message was clear. Debbie hadn't stopped. She'd simply started rotating through every agency she could think to weaponize. Alvarez called me that evening, her tone different than before, more urgent. She'd cross-referenced the code enforcement complaint's filing time with cell tower data obtained through a separate, unrelated warrant tied to the tire slashing investigation. And the geographic overlap was, in her words, very interesting. She couldn't share full details yet, citing an active investigation, but she told me to keep documenting everything, that the sheriff's office was closer to something than they'd been in months. I hung up the phone that night feeling, for the first time, like the law might actually be catching up to Debbie Voss. Meanwhile, Gary's quiet audit of old board minutes turned up something even more damning. A covenant amendment from 4 years back, supposedly passed by unanimous board vote, extending HOA aesthetic jurisdiction over adjacent unincorporated parcels within 500 feet of the subdivision boundary. A clause that conveniently included my land. The problem, Gary explained, was that he had no memory of voting on any such amendment, and neither did 2 other board members he'd carefully asked about it. Only Debbie and 1 deceased former board member, conveniently unable to confirm or deny anything, were listed as having attended that particular meeting. Danny lit up when I told him. A covenant amendment passed without proper quorum or genuine vote, especially one specifically designed to extend jurisdiction over a target's property, wasn't just sloppy governance. It was potential fraud, forgery of official association records, exactly the kind of thing that could unravel everything Debbie had built. We needed the original meeting minutes and signature pages to prove it. Documents Debbie kept locked in a file cabinet in her own home office rather than the community center. An arrangement Gary said had always struck him as unusual but never worth questioning until now. Getting those documents legally would require either Debbie's cooperation, unlikely, or a formal legal demand through the county's nonprofit oversight process, slow and uncertain. Danny suggested we start that process anyway, building pressure even if it took months, while continuing to gather corroborating evidence from other angles in the meantime. October marked 1 year since I'd bought the land. 1 year since Debbie's first letter had arrived like a paper cut that never quite healed. I sat in my stand that anniversary morning and realized I no longer felt like prey waiting for the next attack. I felt like a man closing in on something. The fake stakes, the forged notice, the shell company, the phantom covenant amendment. Each piece Debbie had used to torment me was slowly becoming a piece of evidence pointing back at her. The same paperwork obsession she'd weaponized against half the neighborhood now threatening to become her undoing. Carol brought news that a third family, the Whitfields, had quietly begun asking questions of their own after learning about my situation through the Facebook thread, having faced their own baseless fine 2 years earlier that they'd simply paid rather than fight, assuming they had no other choice. I reached out to the Whitfields myself, and to my surprise, they agreed to talk to Danny about their experience. willing to add their story to a pattern of behavior that no longer looked like isolated disputes but like a documented, years-long campaign of control, fraud, and financial exploitation, with 3 separate households now willing to speak, plus Gary's internal documentation, plus the sheriff's ongoing investigation. Danny told me we'd crossed a threshold. "This isn't a neighbor dispute anymore," he said. "This is a case. She's not going to see it coming until it's already on top of her." I felt something shift in myself hearing that, a year's worth of fear finally starting to curdle into something closer to resolve. I wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake, but I was done being afraid in my own home, on my own land, over a stand my father would have been proud of. Debbie, oblivious to how much ground she'd lost, doubled down instead of backing off. She announced at the November board meeting a formal motion to pursue legal action against non-compliant adjacent property owners. A motion aimed squarely and unmistakably at forcing my hunting rights into court. On her terms, at her chosen time. Gary voted against the motion. The first time in 6 years he'd publicly broken with her, and 2 other board members abstained rather than support it outright. A small mutiny that visibly startled Debbie even as she pushed the motion through on a narrow 3-2 margin anyway. That narrow vote told me everything I needed to know about how fragile her control had actually become. Propped up for years by nobody looking closely enough. By neighbors too tired or too intimidated to ask the questions Gary was finally starting to ask out loud in that meeting room. Danny began drafting a formal legal response to the board's threatened action. One that wouldn't just defend my hunting rights but would counter with everything we'd gathered. The forged covenant amendment, the shell company payments, the pattern of harassment stretching back over a year. All of it, laid out plainly. We decided to wait for the right moment to file. Not out of hesitation, but strategy. Debbie needed to overextend herself just a little further. Needed to believe she still held all the power, before the ground gave way beneath her entirely. December was coming, and with it, I sensed, so was she. December opened with Debbie filing an official lawsuit against me personally. Not through the HOA's attorney, but through a private firm she'd apparently hired herself. Seeking an injunction to force removal of my stand and monetary damages for diminished property values she claimed my hunting activity had caused. Danny read the filing and actually laughed, calling it thin, poorly cited, clearly rushed. "She's panicking," he said. "This isn't the move of someone confident in their position. This is someone trying to control the timeline before the timeline controls her." We filed our response within the week. Evidence attached in full. The countersuit hit Debbie's inbox like a thrown brick. Forged county documents, the shell company payments, the phantom covenant amendment complete with Gary's sworn statement, 3 other households' harassment testimonies, all bundled into a filing that transformed her offensive lawsuit into a defensive scramble overnight. Whispering Pines buzzed within days. The Facebook thread exploding with speculation once court filings became public record, and a local reporter, tipped off by Carol, picked up the story for the county paper under a headline about HOA financial irregularities that named Debbie directly for the first time. Debbie's response wasn't retreat. It was escalation to a level none of us had predicted. She showed up at my property line herself one evening. No golf cart. No security patrol. Just her. Standing at the fence with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Something unraveling behind her eyes. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, voice shaking, not with sadness but with a fury that had clearly been building far longer than the past year. "I built that community from nothing. I protected it. Here's newspaper story destroy everything I've worked for." I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I hadn't destroyed anything, that every document in that filing was one she'd created herself. She stared at me a long moment, then said something that chilled me more than any letter ever had. "Then maybe that stand shouldn't still be standing." I reported the threat to Deputy Alvarez immediately, who took it seriously enough to add a formal harassment and intimidation charge to the growing case file, and who warned me, gently but firmly, to stay alert, to keep my cameras running, to call if anything at all felt wrong going forward. 2 nights later, Scout's barking woke me at 3 a.m., frantic in a way I'd never heard before. I grabbed the shotgun and my phone and stepped onto the porch to see a flickering orange glow through the trees, coming from exactly where my stand stood 16 feet up that old oak. I ran barefoot through the frozen grass, adrenaline drowning out the cold, and found the base of my ladder engulfed, flames climbing fast toward the platform, toward a year of memories with Ellie and mornings with my dad's ghost sitting quiet beside me in that stand I'd built with my own hands. I called 911 first, then grabbed the garden hose, knowing full well it wouldn't reach far enough to matter. Watching helplessly as fire ate through pressure-treated lumber I'd sweated over one board at a time. The volunteer fire department arrived within 15 minutes, but by then, there wasn't much left to save. Deputy Alvarez arrived alongside the fire investigator, grim-faced, already treating the scene as arson before anyone said the word aloud. Accelerant residue was obvious even to my untrained eye. A scorched gas can abandon 20 feet into the tree line, careless in a way that suggested panic more than planning. The investigator lifted a partial print off the gas can's handle within the week. It would take time to run through the system, but everyone standing in those woods that night, myself included, already had a name circling in our minds, a name that had just crossed a line no covenant violation ever could. Debbie, when questioned by Alvarez 2 days later, denied everything, claimed she'd been home alone all night with no alibi beyond her own word, a detail that struck Alvarez as notably thin for someone with as much to lose as Debbie now clearly did in this widening investigation. But without the print match confirmed yet, without a witness, without more than circumstance, they couldn't arrest her outright. Debbie walked free from that interview and, astonishingly, back onto the offensive, filing a police report of her own claiming I'd threatened her at the fence line first, inverting the entire encounter. I had, fortunately, activated a voice recorder on my phone the moment she'd approached my fence that evening, a habit Danny had insisted I adopt weeks earlier given everything else going on. The recording captured her words clearly. "I built that community, and then maybe that stand shouldn't still be standing." I handed the recording to Alvarez immediately. It didn't prove arson on its own, but it established motive and intent with a clarity that made Debbie's countercomplaint collapse the moment the deputy reviewed it, adding one more piece to a case now spanning fraud, forgery, harassment, threats, and possible arson. Word of the fire spread through Millbrook fast, the county paper running a follow-up story with photos of the charred stand, the reporter now openly investigating Debbie's history at Whispering Pines, interviewing the Okonkwo's, the Ramirez's, The Hendersons. Families who'd fled years earlier and finally had a reason to speak up. Each interview added another thread to a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Manufactured violations, fabricated fines, forged documents. Families driven out one by one over 6 years by a woman who'd built her authority on nobody ever comparing notes across the properties she'd targeted. Debbie's own board began to fracture publicly. Gary resigned in a written statement citing serious concerns about governance irregularities I should have questioned sooner. A statement that read almost like an apology to me and everyone else Debbie had steamrolled during her tenure as president. Ashley, the newer board member who'd once helped spread the group chat rumors, reached out to me directly, tearful, admitting she'd believed Debbie's version of events entirely, never imagining the woman coordinating community safety concerns was the one setting fires in the dark to punish a man for owning land legally. I didn't rebuild the stand right away. Something in me needed the scorched earth to sit a while. A visible wound matching the invisible one I'd carried all year. Proof that this fight had cost something real before it cost Debbie anything at all in return. Renee drove out the morning after the fire and just held on to me in the yard for a long time. Not saying much, because there wasn't much to say to a brother who'd nearly lost more than a tree stand to a woman's obsession with control over land she'd never owned an inch of. The fingerprint results came back 11 days later. A match to Debbie Voss. Confirmed against prints on file from an unrelated background check years prior tied to a volunteer position at Ellie's old elementary school. A mundane record that would end up sealing the arson case against her. Alvarez called me personally with the news, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of an investigator watching a long, frustrating case finally click into place. An arrest warrant was being prepared, she said, and given the scope of everything else Danny and I had compiled, additional charges were likely to follow. Debbie was arrested 3 days later at Whispering Pines itself. In broad daylight, deputies walking her out of her own front door past a small crowd of neighbors who'd once trusted her judgment on everything from mailbox colors to who belonged in their community and who supposedly didn't. Carol texted me a single photo from her porch. Debbie in the back of a patrol car, staring straight ahead. The Queen of Whispering Pines reduced to a mugshot waiting to happen. I didn't feel triumphant looking at it. Not exactly. Mostly I just felt the exhausted relief of a held breath finally released. The arson charge alone carried serious prison time under Georgia law, given the property value and reckless endangerment involved. But it was only the beginning of what prosecutors would eventually stack against her once Danny's civil case documentation landed in the district attorney's hands the following week. The forged covenant amendment became a forgery charge. The shell company payments became embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty charges spanning 3 years of HOA dues. The pattern of harassment against me, the Okonkwo's, the Ramirez's, and the Hendersons became a stalking and intimidation case with 4 named victims and counting. Reporters from as far as Atlanta picked up the story once the full scope emerged. HOA president accused of years-long fraud and arson campaign running in outlets well beyond our little county paper. Debbie's face and name attached to a story she'd spent 6 years making sure nobody could tell about her. I testified before a grand jury that January, laying out the same folder I'd built from that very first laughable letter, now grown into a chronicle spanning 15 months of fake stakes, forged notices, phantom board votes, embezzled dues, and finally, fire climbing up a ladder I'd built with my father's memory in mind. The grand jury returned an indictment on all major counts within a day of deliberation. A swiftness Danny said reflected just how overwhelming the evidence had become once assembled in one place. Evidence that existed only because I'd refused, out of stubbornness more than strategy, to simply fold and move away. Debbie posted bail but was barred from Whispering Pines entirely under a protective order covering all 4 named victims, meaning the woman who'd once ruled that neighborhood from her podium and her Lexus could no longer even drive past the gate she'd guarded so jealously for 6 long years. The board, what remained of it after Gary's resignation, voted unanimously to dissolve the disputed covenant amendment that had falsely extended jurisdiction over my land, restoring the boundary to exactly what my deed had always said it was. Felt strange, receiving in writing what had always simply been true. Whispering Pines held an emergency election for a new board president, and to nobody's surprise, Carol won in a landslide, promising transparency, term limits, and an independent financial audit covering every year of Debbie's tenure. A promise the remaining board members seemed almost relieved to support after everything that had come out. That audit, completed by March, uncovered even more than the initial disclosure had suggested. Nearly $90,000 funneled through Voss Property Consulting over 5 years. Dues meant for landscaping and community upkeep instead padding accounts that existed for one purpose only, funding Debbie's sense of ownership over people who'd simply wanted a quiet neighborhood. The Whitfields, the Hendersons, and even the long-departed Okonkwo's, tracked down by the reporter for follow-up interviews, all filed civil claims against Debbie personally. Once the criminal case established the pattern so thoroughly, seeking restitution for fines paid, property sold at a loss, and years spent afraid in their own homes, I filed my own civil suit alongside them, not for the money particularly, though the stand alone represented real cost, but because Danny insisted a formal judgment mattered symbolically. A permanent public record stating plainly that Deborah Voss had built her authority on lies, fraud, and fire. Debbie's defense attorney tried to paint her, at a preliminary hearing, as a grieving widow whose late husband's hunting death had left her with an understandable, if extreme, aversion to firearms on nearby properties, hoping for sympathy that might soften the eventual sentencing recommendations from an increasingly hostile prosecution. But the prosecutor countered simply, and devastatingly, by noting that grief didn't explain embezzling $90,000 in HOA dues, didn't explain forging county documents against families with nothing to do with hunting at all, didn't explain 6 years of manufactured cruelty long before I ever bought my land. I sat in that courtroom and, for the first time, let myself actually feel something like pity alongside the anger, understanding that whatever pain had once lived in Debbie Voss had curdled, over years of unchecked power, into something that no longer resembled grief at all, just hunger for control dressed up as protection. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't undo the fire, the fear, the year I'd spent looking over my shoulder on land I'd rightfully bought. But it let me walk out of that courthouse without carrying her poison forward into whatever peace I still hoped to build on that scorched, stubborn ground. By April, plea negotiations began in earnest. Debbie's attorney, recognizing the mounting evidence, left little room for a not guilty verdict at trial. The DA offering a deal contingent on full restitution to every named victim and a sentencing recommendation that would still guarantee real time behind bars regardless of any plea. Danny warned me plea deals could still fall apart at the last minute. That Debbie's attorney might push for a trial if he sensed any weakness in our documentation. So I spent that spring rereading every page of my folder one more time, checking dates, checking signatures, leaving nothing to chance. I finally rebuilt the stand that April, cutting fresh lumber, welding new rungs, choosing the exact same oak because some things deserved to be reclaimed rather than abandoned to whatever fear Debbie had tried to plant in that ground alongside her lies. Pete helped me raise the platform on a warm Saturday morning. Ellie came out for the christening, as Renee jokingly called it, and sat with me on the new platform at dusk, asking if the bad lady was really gone this time. I told her yes, mostly true now, and watched her face relax into the kind of unguarded relief only a kid can show so plainly. Carol's new board pushed through term limits and a mandatory financial transparency policy within her first 2 months. Changes Debbie had blocked for years under various procedural excuses. Whispering Pines started to feel, according to Pete, like an actual neighborhood again instead of a kingdom with a nervous population. The Facebook thread that had once buzzed with rumors and speculation shifted tone entirely. Neighbors sharing stories now instead of suspicions. The Hendersons even considering whether to move back given the changed leadership. A possibility that would have seemed unthinkable a year earlier under Debbie's reign. I gave one more interview to the County Reporter that spring, laying out not just what had happened to me but the years of pattern behind it, hoping other small towns reading it might recognize the shape of a Debbie Voss forming in their own HOA before it cost anyone else a fire in the night. Deputy Alvarez told me, off the record over coffee one afternoon, that cases like this rarely resolved so cleanly, that most victims simply moved away rather than fight, which was exactly why people like Debbie so often got years, sometimes decades, before anyone finally built a file thick enough to stop them. I thought about that a lot, about how close I'd come to just selling and leaving that first winter, about how easily this could have become one more quiet story nobody outside Whispering Pines ever heard. Another family run off a covenant they never should have been subject to in the first place. Gary reached out one last time before the sentencing hearing, thanking me, awkwardly, for forcing a reckoning he admitted he should have pushed for years earlier himself. I told him it wasn't too late to have done the right thing eventually, and that mattered more than most people ever managed when the moment came. The civil suits settled faster than anyone expected once Debbie's remaining assets, largely tied up in the Whispering Pines house itself, became subject to a court-ordered sale to cover restitution. The same house from which she'd once surveyed my tree stand through an upstairs window like a queen inspecting her borders. I learned the buyers were a young family relocating from Atlanta. No connection to Whispering Pines history. No idea yet what that house had witnessed, though Carol promised to tell them gently once they'd settled in. Figuring some histories deserved honesty even when the telling was uncomfortable. My insurance claim for the burn stand finally cleared that May. Months delayed by the anonymous tip investigation that had once threatened to raise my premiums. Resolved now in my favor once the arson finding made clear exactly who'd created the danger the insurer had originally been worried about. Danny filed the final restitution paperwork listing every victim by name. Dollar amounts calculated with the same careful precision Debbie had once used to calculate fake fines against people who'd never done anything but buy a house or a piece of land she decided she didn't like. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for June. Almost exactly 2 years since I'd first stood in that courthouse reading my own deed twice, feeling like a man who'd finally done something right with his life, never imagining how thoroughly that same deed would end up being the thing that saved it. I spent the weeks before the hearing hunting again in earnest. Bow season still months off but scouting trails, checking cameras, watching the funnel where deer still crossed at dawn regardless of anything happening in courtrooms or county papers. The woods indifferent and steady the way woods always are. Renee asked if I planned to speak at the sentencing. I told her yes, that I owed it to the Okonkwo's and the Ramirez's and the Hendersons, families who'd left quietly with no chance to say anything at all, to finally put their names and mine into a record that couldn't be erased or rewritten. Pete offered to drive me to the courthouse that morning, said he wanted to be there too, having lived beside Whispering Pines long enough to watch families come and go under Debbie's shadow without ever quite understanding, until now, just how deliberate that shadow had actually been. Carol texted the morning of the hearing. A simple message: whatever happens today, you gave this town its neighborhood back. I read it twice in the courthouse parking lot before heading inside, feeling the particular gravity of a year and a half finally narrowing down to a single room. Deputy Alvarez met me in the hallway, in plain clothes for once. Off duty but there anyway, she said, because some cases stuck with an investigator long after the paperwork closed. She squeezed my shoulder once, a small gesture that meant more than any of her official reports ever had. Debbie arrived flanked by her attorney, noticeably diminished from the woman who'd once gavelled a room to order like she owned the county itself. Her blazer looser, her posture smaller, the polish that had carried her through 6 years of quiet cruelty finally worn all the way through. The judge reviewed the plea agreement first, restitution terms, sentencing recommendation, before opening the floor to victim impact statements. A formality Danny said usually shaped final sentencing more than people expected, especially when multiple victims spoke to the same sustained pattern of harm. The Hendersons went first, their statement read by their now-adult daughter, describing a childhood cut short by a forced move, friendships severed, a home sold at a loss that still echoed in their family's finances a decade later, all traced back to a manufactured flagpole violation nobody had ever actually seen in person. The Ramirez's spoke next, the father's voice steady but tight, describing the shame of feeling driven out of a home they'd worked their whole lives to afford, over a garden shed that sat, provably, outside any jurisdiction Debbie had ever legitimately held, a fact she'd known and hidden all along. Ashley, the former board member, surprised the room by asking to speak as well, not as a victim exactly, but as someone who'd unknowingly helped spread Debbie's lies, wanting on record that she'd learned, too late, how easily good intentions could be weaponized by someone skilled at wearing them like armor. Gary spoke briefly, apologizing again publicly for years of deference that had let real harm continue unchecked. A statement the judge noted for the record, as evidence of institutional failure alongside individual culpability. A detail Danny said could matter for the civil suits still pending resolution. Then it was my turn, folder in hand out of habit more than need, and told the room about a father who'd taught me to hunt on land I'd bought to honor him, about a fire that nearly took both the stand and the memory it held, about 15 months spent afraid on my own property. I didn't ask for anything dramatic, just acknowledgement that what happened to me and to every family before me wasn't neighborly disagreement but sustained, deliberate harm dressed up in HOA letterhead, and that the sentence handed down today should reflect the actual weight of 6 years, not just one fire. The judge listened without interrupting, taking notes through every statement, and when I finished, thanked me for the folder Danny had submitted into evidence months earlier, calling it in an aside that would end up in the local paper's coverage. The most thorough documentation of a pattern like this I've seen in 20 years on this bench. Debbie's attorney offered a final statement on her behalf. Brief, unconvincing, citing her community contributions and her husband's death as mitigating context the court should weigh against the sentencing guidelines, an argument that visibly failed to move a judge who just spent an hour hearing four separate families describe years of calculated cruelty. The judge called a short recess before sentencing, and I stepped into the hallway with Renee, Pete, and Carol, the weight of 18 months finally settling into something that felt, for the first time, like it might actually be close to over. One way or another, within the hour, the recess stretched longer than expected. The judge, apparently reviewing additional documentation Danny had flagged that morning. A last detail from the financial audit that had only been finalized the week before and needed formal entry into the record before sentencing could proceed as planned. Danny pulled me aside in the hallway, his expression unusually charged. "The forensic accountant found something else," he said quietly. "It's bigger than the 90,000. There's a second shell company, opened right after the first one got flagged in our filing." She kept going. "Jake." Even after she knew we were watching, my stomach tightened hearing it. Even facing arson and embezzlement charges, even with her board collapsing and her neighbors turning against her, Debbie had apparently opened a second front, funneling funds through an entity registered under her sister's name in a neighboring county, banking on nobody connecting the two accounts. The forensic accountant, called back to the stand once the judge reconvened, walked the courtroom through the discovery methodically, nearly 40,000 additional dollars moved in the 6 months between my initial public records request and Debbie's eventual arrest. Funds diverted even as the walls closed in around her. The judge's expression hardened visibly as the numbers were read into the record, the picture forming not of a woman who'd made mistakes and stopped, but of someone who'd kept exploiting the community's trust literally up until the moment deputies walked her out her own front door in handcuffs. Debbie's attorney requested a brief conference with his client, whispering urgently while she shook her head, visibly agitated, before finally nodding, some unspoken calculation resolving behind her eyes as she straightened in her chair for what would turn out to be the first honest moment she'd offered anyone in 18 months. "I want to say something," Debbie said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's murmur, the judge granting permission with a curt nod. She stood slowly, the polish gone entirely now, just a woman facing the full weight of 6 years finally catching up to her all at once. "My husband died because someone careless with a firearm decided the rules didn't apply to him," she began, and for a moment I braced for the same deflection her attorney had already tried. But then her voice cracked, and something rawer than I'd ever seen from her spilled out instead. "I told myself I was protecting people, setting rules so nobody else's family went through what mine did. But somewhere along the way I stopped protecting anyone but myself." She looked at me directly for the first time in months. The fire wasn't about deer. It was about control I'd lost everywhere else in my life. The courtroom went silent. Even the judge, who'd clearly seen plenty of hollow apologies, seemed to register this one as something different. Not an excuse but an admission. The first crack in 6 years of a story Debbie had told herself so completely she'd nearly believed her own righteousness until this exact moment. I forged the amendment because I was afraid the board would finally see how much control I'd taken that was never mine to have, she continued, voice steadying now into something almost like relief at finally saying it plainly. I opened the second account because I panicked. I kept lying because stopping felt like admitting I'd become someone I hated. Danny leaned over and whispered that this kind of full allocution, admitting specific intent behind each act rather than just accepting a general plea, would almost certainly factor into sentencing, cutting both ways, showing genuine remorse but also confirming the deliberateness prosecutors needed for the harshest available guidelines. The judge asked Debbie directly whether she understood the scope of harm across 6 years and 4 documented families, plus the additional victims the second shell company implicated in ongoing dues overcharges nobody had even fully audited yet. Debbie nodded, said yes, and sat back down without further protest. The prosecutor rose next, laying out the state's final sentencing recommendation given the new financial revelation. The original plea framework no longer adequately reflected the full scope of harm, and the state was formally requesting the court consider the maximum available range across all combined charges instead. Debbie's attorney objected, arguing the new information had emerged too late in proceedings to fairly recalibrate a negotiated plea, but the judge overruled him firmly, noting that ongoing criminal conduct discovered mid-hearing wasn't a procedural technicality. It was material evidence a fair sentencing simply couldn't ignore. I watched Debbie's face through all of it, looking for the woman who'd once smiled at me over a fence line and promised things would be so much easier if I just gave up. She wasn't there anymore. Not really. Just someone finally sitting still long enough to feel the weight of everything she'd built. The judge called a second, shorter recess to allow both sides to prepare final arguments under the revised framework. In the hallway, Renee gripped my hand hard, and Pete just shook his head slowly, muttering something about how you never really know a person until the fire finally reaches all the way down. Carol found me by the water fountain, her own hands shaking slightly. 6 years, she said, more to herself than to me. 6 years, and I never once asked why the Okonkwo's left so fast. I just accepted whatever she told us. I keep thinking about how many times I could have asked and didn't. I told her what I'd told Gary weeks earlier, that it wasn't too late to have finally asked, and that the asking mattered even now, maybe especially now, with a whole neighborhood learning in real time what happens when nobody questions the person holding all the paperwork and all the keys. When the courtroom reconvened, the judge moved swiftly through the revised recommendations, addressing each charge in sequence: forgery of official documents, embezzlement exceeding $130,000 combined across both shell companies, for counts of stalking and intimidation, and 1 count of arson with reckless endangerment. On the arson charge alone, given the proximity of my trailer and the volunteer fire department's own report noting how quickly the blaze could have spread toward inhabited structures under different wind conditions, the judge signaled clearly that leniency wasn't going to define this particular portion of the sentence. The prosecutor read a final summary connecting every thread: the fake stakes designed to intimidate, the forged county notice meant to terrify, the phantom covenant amendment meant to manufacture false jurisdiction, the shell companies meant to enrich her personally, and finally the fire meant to destroy what 6 years of manipulation hadn't managed to take from me. This wasn't a woman who lost control once, the prosecutor said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. This was calculated, sustained, and remarkably resourceful cruelty. deployed against anyone who threatened her sense of ownership over a community that was never actually hers to command in the way she believed. Debbie's attorney made a final plea for mercy, citing her allocution, her cooperation once cornered. Her genuine grief, however distorted it had become over the years. The judge listened respectfully, then noted that remorse arriving only after every avenue of denial had been exhausted carried real but limited weight in sentencing.
MS. The judge said finally, addressing her directly, "You spent 6 years teaching this community that questioning you carried consequences. Today, this court is teaching you the same lesson in return." The room went utterly still, waiting for the number that would finally give this whole ordeal its shape.
The judge sentenced Debbie to 12 years, with eligibility for parole after serving a mandatory minimum of 8. On the combined charges, alongside full restitution to all 5 now confirmed victims, forfeiture of both shell companies' remaining assets, and a permanent injunction barring her from serving in any HOA leadership role for life. Debbie absorbed the sentence without visible reaction beyond a slow exhale. The fight finally, completely gone out of her. A woman who'd once controlled 40 households down to their mailbox color, now facing a decade defined entirely by rules she'd have no say in writing whatsoever. The bailiff moved to escort her out, and for one brief moment she looked back toward the gallery, toward me specifically, and said something so quiet only the people nearest the aisle could hear it. "I hope that stand keeps standing." I still don't fully know what she meant by it. Maybe it was genuine, some buried piece of the woman who'd once, before grief curdled into control, believed in protecting something worth protecting. Maybe it was just reflex, an echo of the community-minded persona she'd worn so long it had become the only voice she had left to offer anyone. I didn't answer her. That the last 18 months hadn't already said far more completely than words could manage in a courtroom hallway with deputies waiting to lead her toward a transport van and a future entirely outside the kingdom she'd built. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps. Cameras angled toward the 4 families stepping out together for the first time. The Hendersons, the Ramirezes, Ashley standing slightly apart, still working through her own complicated guilt. And me. Folder finally closed. At least for today. In my hands. A reporter asked me how it felt, watching the woman who'd tried to burn down my hunting stand get sentenced to over a decade in prison. I thought about it a long moment before answering, wanting the words to actually mean something instead of just filling airtime for the evening broadcast. "It feels like the system finally worked the way it's supposed to," I said. But it only worked because enough of us kept records and kept talking to each other instead of quietly moving away like she counted on. That's the actual lesson here. Not just what happened to her. Carol, standing nearby, added her own comment about the new board's transparency reforms, about term limits and independent audits now written permanently into Whispering Pines bylaws. Changes she said should have existed years earlier but existed now because enough people had finally refused to look away from an uncomfortable pattern. Gary gave a brief statement too, admitting on camera what he'd told me privately months before, that institutional deference had let real harm continue far longer than it should have, and that he hoped other HOA board members watching this story would learn to ask harder questions of anyone consolidating that much unchecked power. The story ran statewide by evening, then picked up by a couple national outlets interested in the broader pattern of HOA overreach. Debbie's name becoming, almost overnight, shorthand in online discussions for a particular kind of small-scale tyranny dressed up in community-minded language and laminated violation notices. I didn't love the attention. Honestly, never having wanted to become a symbol for anything beyond a man who just wanted to hunt on land he'd legally bought. But if the story helped even one family somewhere else recognize the pattern early, refuse to fold, keep their own folder from the very first letter, felt worth the discomfort, Danny filed the final restitution schedule that same week. Court-ordered payments structured to begin immediately from the forfeited shell company assets. With the Whispering Pines house sale, proceeds allocated first toward the Hendersons and Ramirezes, whose original financial losses predated everyone else's by years. My own restitution, covering the destroyed stand, legal fees, and a portion for emotional distress the court recognized given the arson finding, arrived as a lump sum by August. Money I used, fittingly, to finish the house I'd been slowly building the entire 18 months this whole ordeal had consumed. Renee helped me pick out the front porch railings, joking that I should mount a plaque somewhere commemorating the folder that started as a joke and ended up dismantling 6 years of small-town corruption single-handedly, one certified mail receipt at a time, patient and relentless the way our father had taught me to be. Pete came by most weekends still, helping frame the last of the interior walls, and one evening, sitting on the unfinished porch watching the sun drop behind the tree line, where my rebuilt stand now stood solid against a sky gone gold and quiet, he raised his beer and just said, "You didn't fold." I didn't feel like celebrating exactly, not with 4 other families still working through the wreckage of years Debbie had taken from them long before I ever showed up. But I let myself feel something close to peace for the first time since that first laughable letter had arrived on HOA letterhead demanding I explain myself. In September, a second wave of the story broke when the forensic audit's full findings became public through the civil proceedings, revealing that Debbie's manipulation had extended even further back than anyone initially realized, to her very first year as board president, 6 years earlier than the Okonkwo's flagpole dispute. Her predecessor as board president, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Ferris, who'd since moved to Florida, gave a phone interview to the county reporter describing how Debbie had campaigned aggressively for the position after her husband's death, promising residents someone who understood what real safety looked like. Mrs. with visible regret that she'd stepped back gratefully at the time, relieved someone else wanted the thankless job, never imagining the grief she'd witnessed in Debbie during that campaign would calcify so completely into a 6-year campaign of manufactured control over an entire neighborhood's peace of mind. The audit also revealed Debbie had quietly blocked every proposed bylaw change requiring competitive board elections during her tenure, citing procedural technicalities each time, ensuring she ran essentially unopposed year after year while residents assumed, reasonably, that nobody else wanted the position badly enough to challenge her. Reading through all of it, I understood finally the full architecture of what she'd built. Grief as origin story, safety as justification, procedural control as method, and fear as the mortar holding every fabricated violation and phantom vote together for 6 years without a single resident thinking to compare notes with their neighbors. Ashley reached out one more time that September, having spent months in quiet reflection since the sentencing, to tell me she was starting a small informal network among Georgia homeowners, a resource for people facing HOA overreach to connect, compare documentation, and recognize patterns before they escalated as far as mine had. I agreed to let Danny consult with her project pro bono. Figuring the folder that had once felt like an unbearable burden might as well become something useful for someone else facing their own version of a Debbie Voss in some other quiet neighborhood nobody outside it had ever heard of. October brought bow season back around for the second time since I'd bought the land, and I climbed into my rebuilt stand at dawn on opening day. Coffee steaming in the cold exactly like every year before. Except this time nothing waited in the woods except the woods themselves. A buck stepped into the funnel just past sunrise. Cautious, ears swiveling. Exactly the kind of moment my father had spent countless mornings teaching me to read and respect. I let the moment pass without drawing my bow. Content just to watch. Reminded of why any of this had ever mattered in the first place. Scout dozed at the base of the tree below me, no longer startling at every distant engine or golf cart. Finally as settled into this land as I'd once imagined we both would be the day I signed that deed 2 years earlier, back when I thought the hardest part was already behind us. Ellie visited again that weekend. Older now, steadier climbing the ladder than she'd been the first time, and asked if I'd ever forgive the bad lady. I told her forgiveness wasn't something I owed anyone, but that I didn't carry Debbie Voss around inside me anymore either, and that felt like its own kind of freedom. Renee brought news that November that the civil restitution payments had started reaching the Hendersons and Ramirez's on schedule. Small but steady deposits chipping away at years of loss no court ruling could ever fully repay. But progress nonetheless. Tangible proof the system had eventually actually worked as intended. Carol's board finished its first full year under the new transparency rules, publishing quarterly financial statements openly for the first time in Whispering Pines history. A level of visibility residents told her felt almost radical after 6 years of simply trusting whatever Debbie's office had claimed without question. I got a letter that December, forwarded through Danny's office, from Debbie herself, the first contact since the sentencing. I almost didn't read it, uncertain what use there could be in hearing from her now. But curiosity won out eventually, the way it usually does when a chapter feels unfinished. The letter was short, handwritten, none of the polished HOA letterhead she'd once wielded like a weapon. She wrote that she understood now, too late to matter to anyone but herself, that protecting a community and controlling one had never actually been the same thing, no matter how thoroughly she'd convinced herself otherwise for 6 years. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't ask for anything really, just wanted it on record, in her own hand this time, that the stand had never been the actual threat. She had been folded it and added it, out of old habit more than anything, to the folder that had once been my only defense. I didn't write back. I decided, didn't need an answer to close properly, and I had a house to finish, a stand to hunt from, and a life that had spent 18 months revolving entirely around a woman I no longer needed occupying any more space in it than a single folded letter. By spring, the second shell company's forfeited assets finished processing through the courts, completing restitution for every named victim including the additional overcharged. Dues owed to residents nobody had initially realized were affected until the fuller audit surfaced 6 years of quietly padded landscaping invoices and phantom vendor contracts. Whispering Pines held its second election under the new bylaws that April. Carol re-elected easily, but this time against an actual opponent, a retired accountant named Mr. Delgado, who'd run specifically on continuing the transparency reforms, a genuine contest that would have been unthinkable during Debbie's 6-year uncontested reign. I attended that meeting as an invited guest for the first time, sitting in the audience instead of standing at a podium defending myself against fabricated violations, watching residents debate a landscaping budget with the kind of mundane, healthy disagreement that Debbie's iron control had never once allowed to exist openly. Pete leaned over during a lull in the meeting and whispered that this, boring as it looked, was actually the whole point, a neighborhood functioning the way it was always supposed to. Disagreements settled through actual votes instead of manufactured fear. Mailboxes painted whatever color their owners genuinely preferred. I finished the house that June, exactly 2 years after buying the land, hanging the last piece of trim myself on a Saturday afternoon with Renee's kids running through unfinished rooms and Pete grilling burgers on a portable stand out back. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable joy I'd once feared I might never get back. Ellie asked, climbing the porch steps for the first time since they'd been finished, whether this meant the story was really over now. I told her stories like this one never fully end. Not clean, but that this particular chapter, the hard one, the scary one, had closed as thoroughly as any chapter reasonably could. That evening, after everyone left, I climbed into my stand one more time, not to hunt, just to sit, watching the last light fade over the funnel where deer had crossed every autumn since before I'd ever heard the name Deborah Voss. Land that had outlasted her control the way it would outlast mine too. Someday. I thought about my dad. About the first time he'd sat me on his knee in a stand just like this one, teaching me patience before he ever taught me to draw a bow. Patience that had turned out, 18 months later, to be the exact quality that finally brought down a woman who'd counted on everyone folding first. I thought about the Okonkwo's and the Ramirez's and the Hendersons, families who'd left quietly with no folder, no lawyer, no reporter picking up their story, and I hoped somewhere they'd heard how it ended, hoped it gave them even a fraction of the closure their own years of loss had never gotten to have. I thought about Gary and Carol and even Ashley, ordinary people who'd simply stopped deferring once someone finally showed them the paperwork proving deference had never been owed in the first place. Proof that most tyrannies, even small ones confined to 40 houses around a dead golf course, survive only as long as nobody looks closely. And I thought, finally, about the stand itself, rebuilt plank by plank on the same scorched ground, standing solid against a darkening sky, proof that some things, patiently and stubbornly rebuilt, outlast whoever tries to burn them down, whether that fire comes from a gas can in the night or a laminated notice on a gate. The following autumn, I hosted the first annual Whispering Pines and Millbrook Cookout, an idea Carol and I cooked up together, inviting both sides of the old boundary line that Debbie had spent 6 years pretending didn't exist. Families who'd once been strangers now sharing folding tables under my oak trees. The Hendersons drove up from 2 counties over, having decided against moving back permanently but wanting, they said, to finally see the neighborhood on their own terms instead of the terms Debbie had forced on them years earlier. Their daughter, now grown, hugged me longer than I expected, saying thank you simply, twice. Ashley's HOA resource network had grown, by then, into a modest nonprofit helping homeowners across 3 counties document overreach before it escalated. Danny still consulting occasionally, The folder that started my whole ordeal, now essentially a template other families used to protect themselves from their own would-be Debbie Voss. Gary stopped by that cookout too. Quieter than most, but present in a way that felt like its own kind of ongoing amends. Helping Pete flip burgers. Laughing at Ellie's terrible jokes. A man who'd finally learned, a little late but not too late, what it looked like to actually show up. I got word that winter that Debbie, 2 years into her sentence, had been denied an early appeal. The appellate court finding the original sentencing well within reasonable guidelines given the documented scope of harm. I read the news without much feeling either way. A closed chapter simply confirming it intended to stay closed. Carol's transparency reforms became something of a model for 2 neighboring HOAs after their own boards faced pressure from residents who'd read about whispering
Pines and started asking uncomfortable questions of their own leadership. A small ripple outward from one stubborn mechanic's refusal to take down a tree stand.
My dad's old bow still hangs above the fireplace in the finished house now, next to a framed photo of him and me from years before the cancer, before the land, before any of this. I think he'd have liked knowing the stand survived. And more than that, I think he'd have liked knowing I didn't fold. Renee tells people now, half joking, that her brother accidentally became a small-town legend over a deer stand. And maybe that's true. But mostly I just think of myself as a man who kept good records, trusted his neighbors when they finally spoke up, and refused to let someone else's fear become his own. 2 years after the fire, the land still holds everything it ever did. The funnel where deer cross at dawn. The ridge where my father once taught me patience. And now, a house built slow and steady on ground that proved sturdier than any covenant Debbie Voss ever tried to forge against it. I still climb the stand most mornings during season. Coffee steaming. Scout dozing below. Watching a world that never once needed her permission to keep turning exactly the way it always had before she ever pulled up in that white Lexus and decided my land was somehow hers to control. Carol calls sometimes just to talk. No HOA business at all. And Pete still comes by most weekends. And somewhere out there for families rebuilt lives that once looked broken beyond repair. Proof that stubborn patience kept paperwork, and neighbors willing to finally talk to each other can outlast even the most determined tyranny. My father used to say the woods don't care what you're afraid of. They just wait for you to show up anyway. I showed up anyway, every single day of that fight, and the land, unbothered by any of it the whole time, was still exactly where I left it, waiting. When it was finally over, the stand still stands. And somewhere behind me, 40 houses around a quiet golf course finally learned what it looks like when a community stops being ruled and starts, slowly, actually being one. The END.